Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for joining online as well. As briefly introduced, I'm Riley Smallman. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. Welcome to Archaeology, Identity, and Crows. So when I first planned this, I was like, this is nice. I've got three very clear topics I want to talk about. There's just one small problem. They all blend together just a little bit, so it's essentially going to be a talk in kind of two parts. The first part is going to be talking about archaeology and identity, relations surrounding professional and personal identity. And then the second part is going to be about my research, which is on birds of the corvid family. So before I go too much further, I wanted to throw up an absolute heap of labels and micro-labels to introduce myself just a little bit more. So personally, I do use micro-labels. I always get a little bit self-conscious because they always feel a bit too complicated. And it's like, oh, why are you using such specific terms? For me, that's how I be authentic to myself. It was quite satisfying to be putting all this together and realize I've got way more micro-labels I can use for my professional career. So let's simplify this a little bit. So in short, I'm a guyish, non-binary person. I'm demi-pan, which the easiest way I can explain, very rarely attracted to anyone. I study archaeology, so specifically I'm looking at past cultures and perspectives, primarily through bird bones. I was also trained on human remains and some forensics techniques. There's just that one term up in the corner that's being a bit awkward. So what the first part of this talk is going to be is who can really claim the identity of a scientist? Are archaeologists scientists? Are we doing science? Is that a thing we do? I apologize, I know everyone hates this cliche. I'm throwing up a big definition before we start. So first of all, get us all on the same page. What even is science? So I've stolen this from the Science Council. I hope they know what they're talking about, but I gather many people might try and disagree. So science is a pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. That's the definition I'm going to be using going forth. So what on earth is archaeology? Dictionary.com, fantastic. They, right off the bat, say we're a scientific study, so I should just leave, I guess. We're science. But then they go on to say of historic and prehistoric peoples and their cultures by analyzing a range of things, typically things that have been dug out of the ground. So if you're throwing up anything to do with history and culture, most people are going to go, well, that's humanities then, isn't it? So we're kind of getting into a bit of a conflict of whether we're science or humanities. Specifically within Exeter, I'm within the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. My research is funded through the Arts and Humanities Research Council, so they clearly all think we're humanities as well. Now, before I go too much further, I feel like some people in the room are going like, what on earth are you talking about with archaeology? What even is that? So some people will probably just think we're people who dig holes and have dirty boots. Honestly, not planned. This just happened. So I wanted to throw up a few things. So I'm specifically a bioarchaeologist. I'm a zooarchaeologist. So I work with animal remains to look at the way humans were interacting with animals throughout the past. So bio is quite there in the title. We're doing biological remains, so that kind of checks out. Archaeogenetics, that checks out. Isotope archaeology, yeah, we're still seeing sciences coming up. Digital computational archaeology, yeah, that's at least technology. That's pretty cool. Experimental archaeology, not too many people tend to know this one. So it's essentially designing experiments. So you're looking at the ways either tools make specific marks or how you make specific tools and then comparing that to the archaeological record. So in its methodology, well, it's experimental, isn't it? So technically, that's still falling under science. So material culture anthropology and archaeology, I put them at to kind of just try and start testing where this boundary is, really. So material culture is essentially anything you find. Sometimes it does kind of become biological remains. So for example, if you've got like pot weaving stuff, basket weaving, or pots, that's where I was going. So ceramics tends to be discussed a lot within material culture, but essentially the methods we're using again there's a lot of microscopy, there's a lot of thin section analysis, and a lot of compositional analysis, so it still falls under scientific methods. So anthropology at the bottom, this is a bit of a smudge here. It's not a sub-discipline of archaeology. Actually in the US, anthropology, and then you have archaeology as a sub-discipline there, because we're both looking at human culture. It's just a difference of timescales, really. Again, anthropological methods are all very, you could consider your interviews with people as a form of experiment, and you're collecting data, and it's really difficult to analyze data that covers the whole range of human thought and experience, so that's really difficult to tackle, but I would argue still it's experimental and scientific in methodology. So what we're starting to see coming up is there's this thing being formed, which I am going to term a binary, between humanities and science. Now back in 1959, this guy C.P. Snow, I always bring him up when I talk about this, started talking about the two cultures in the scientific revolution, basically pointing out the problems that are inherent with having humanities and science as these completely two distinct camps. So just to, yeah, that is going to do it automatically. There's obviously quite a lot of problems that come in when you're splitting things into a binary in this way. So funding is obviously the big topic. I know everyone's going to say they don't have enough funding, but when you're perceived as a humanities, but you're trying to do scientific methodologies, there really isn't a lot of money around. Value of study, that kind of fits in with perceptions generally, how are we perceiving each other, how are funding bodies perceiving us, how are the public perceiving us and the research we do as being worthwhile. Fundamentally, the language we're using is going to affect how we communicate with each other, which affects how we collaborate with each other. So we might start thinking, well, I'm not going to go and talk to this person because they're not going to understand, or I'm not going to talk to this person because I won't understand. Spaces, of course, are always a big thing within academia as well, especially when you're talking about conferences and things, knowing which audience you can actually take your work to, which is going to have a big impact on what communities you feel you can form, which is all, of course, fundamental to your identity. So what we get with archaeology is this feeling that it's kind of caught between two boxes. It's non-binary, if you will. It's kind of, you've got your science box, you've got your humanities box. We don't really know which one we fit in, and depending on how others perceive us, we might get pushed from one box to the other. I've been in quite a lot of spaces that are like, I've been in a humanities space and told that I'm a scientist and they don't know why I'm there, or I've been in a science space and everyone's going, but you're humanities, so why are you here? It gets really awkward. This isn't only affecting archaeology, of course. I've already mentioned anthropology feels this a lot. There's different scales of this as well. I imagine there are people who feel like they're caught between two different subjects quite a lot, and it's like, well, which subject do you really fit into? And it's like, oh, come on, both. So this is all a bit familiar for me as a non-binary person. So for most of my life, I was being perceived as being in one box. And then when I came out, everyone went, ah, so you're in the other box then. And I went, well, no. So depending on what context I'm in, I'm going to be perceived as being in one box or the other. I'm going to be treated as whether I'm in one box or the other. It makes it difficult to know what spaces I want to be in and which communities I want to be in. Of course, this isn't limited to non-binary people either. A lot of people in the bi+ community feel the same. The boxes are labeled slightly different. If you're in the demi or grey communities as well, you're going to be caught between that alloromantic and allosexual boxes and that aromantic, I keep trying to abbreviate them, aromantic and asexual box. So there's a lot of people in communities that are stuck between these boxes. I don't like just standing up here complaining about things. Well, it's kind of cathartic. But I like to try and think, what are we going to do about it? So first things first, I'm not saying scrap the boxes. Obviously, the boxes are great, and there's obviously part of the scientific method to categorize things anyway. They do work in certain circumstances, but it's important to recognize the limitations of the categories and the binaries you're creating and the systems that those are upholding. Improving representation and platforming, I realize I'm talking to the people who know all about this because I'm right here talking to you. But obviously there's a lot of places that still need to improve their representation and platforming of people of different groups. Conversations beyond the binary, again here I'm talking both about the humanities science binary and also gender binaries and any other binary you can think of. I think if we kind of start testing the limits and start thinking about beyond them, then we can have some really interesting conversations, particularly when it comes to collaborations. Now, I've talked about collaborations quite a lot to the point that I felt the need I needed to define specific terms, primarily for myself. But I do think collaborations between disciplines are really, really fruitful because you will suddenly discover things that you never even thought you could investigate. And it's just really good fun, and we learn more about the world as well. So I'll move swiftly on to me attempting to learn about the world, or at least a very specific topic. So I'm a third-year PhD currently, and I'm looking at the ways humans have interacted with and perceived birds of the corvid family in England, kind of as far back as I can find records. In the interest of having us all on the same page, so this is just a quick overview of the timelines I'm discussing. So my project specifically runs not from this 1 million mark, but from like the more recent end of the Paleolithic up until the modern day, which is still a ridiculous amount of time for me to be doing. So time periods vary depending on where you are in the world, because a lot of them are based on what cultures are present at the time and also like what tools they're using, whether they're working with different metals, how their pottery is changing. So this is just to give you an idea. The purple on this arrow here is basically showing prehistoric periods, and the yellow is showing the times when we have written literature, at least sometimes. So my birds, this lovely picture is from Historic England's reference collection. I did a placement with them a couple of years back. So my birds, I'm largely looking at northern raven, carrion crow, rook, western jackdaw, Eurasian magpie, Eurasian jay, tiny bit of red-billed chough. They don't come up much in the archaeological record. Now, if anyone is a bird nerd in here, you're going to be like, where is your hooded crow? The reason I'm not doing hooded crow is because I'm focusing on England. Their current range is kind of Scotland and Ireland. So I have them in the back of my head. I'm not forgetting them, but they're not a primary focus. So I'm using quite a range of methods. Many of these do fall within archaeology, because archaeology just kind of gathers methods from every other discipline. So the first stage is kind of doing the archaeological representation, looking where the corvids are present within archaeological assemblage, mapping them and figuring out if there are any patterns. Then where I'm able to, I've gone to museums, got hold of the bones, doing analyses on them. In some cases where I've been allowed to do destructive sampling, I'm doing isotope archaeology, specifically carbon and nitrogen, to try and investigate their dietary changes. Social zooarchaeology is kind of an expansion of traditional zooarchaeology where we're looking at social relationships between animals and inferring things about, the relationships between humans and animals, so specifically corvids here. I'm stealing some methods from human funerary osteoarchaeology, which is to do with how grave deposits are laid out and what we can learn from those. I've also been tapping into a little bit of modern ecology and behavior because I think it's very important to understand how the species you're studying behaves and interacts with people now so that you can think about how they might have been perceived in the past. Iconography is a really useful source as well because then that can show you how people are choosing to depict certain things, which is borrowing a little bit from semiotic anthropology, which is the study of how symbols are created. And then where I have it available, historic literature. Now that is specifically non-fiction literature because you could do an entire PhD on fictional representation of crows if someone hasn't already done it already. So I'm going to go through just some results highlights that is doing properly. So I won't have time to go through absolutely everything. We'd be here forever, speaking from experience. So essentially what we start to see from this is just showing all species of corvid in archaeological deposits. The big things to notice is the dark green and the orange when they come up, where it just substantially just loads more, going there it's gone, and then there it goes again. Okay, so you're getting huge increases in representation. There's also changes in spatial distributions that mark where the populations are moving around, which is especially important for ravens because we notice that they start to shift away from the eastern counties as they get persecuted more. If you look at modern distributions, they're still really skewed away from eastern counties. So I'm now going to start going through kind of more chronologically of what's going on. So this is probably the most exciting one because this is preliminary results. So yeah, I just wanted to build some anticipation with this one. I haven't actually shared this yet properly. So I'm going to be talking about Iron Age Danebury, which is a big hill fort that's been really quite widely studied. Now, why it's so interesting for the corvids is that quote there, more than 70% of the birds are ravens and 10% are crows or rooks. Now, something that's really interesting about these as well is up in the top left there, they're being deposited as whole skeletons, or as ABGs, as we'd call them, associated bone groups. So essentially, they're mostly representing an entire body. So it suggests that the entire body has been put in one place, rather than, imagine if you've had a chicken dinner and you're just you end up with bones strewn all over the place. These are all together as if they're a whole carcass. So you get those from the Iron Age into the Roman period, so it will come up again. Now, one of the things with the Iron Age is we don't have a lot of human remains. They weren't doing formalized cemeteries like we do now. So there's been a big debate of what on earth were they doing with their dead? One of the leading suggestions has been excarnation, which is leaving a body out so that natural elements and scavengers can have a go at it. So if you know of sky burials, it's essentially a similar concept to that. Now, there's been a lot of investigations looking at the few human remains we have to see if there are any traces of excarnation on them. But as far as I'm aware, what people haven't published on so far is looking at the diets of the scavengers to see if they were eating humans. So without further ado, this is some of my preliminary results. Sean Doherty actually brought this plot together using the data from Stevens et al. For all the non-corvid stuff. But what's particularly interesting here is essentially the higher you go up on your nitrogen side here, is essentially reflecting how high you are up the trophic level. So if you've been eating things further down the food chain, you end up higher than them. And we got some ravens and one crow kind of plotting higher than the humans, which is interesting and weird. So I've got a lot more isotopes in the works. I will actually be doing a presentation at a big conference coming up in a couple of months. So hopefully I'll have all my isotope results back by then, which should confirm what exactly is going on here. But it's an interesting start. So moving on into the Roman periods, like I said, we're still getting more of those associated bone groups, but we're also getting a lot of really cool iconography. There's a lot of written stuff from this period that shows that they were keeping ravens, crows, magpies, and jackdaws as pets. There's a really cool story, there's several really cool stories, I'll try and limit myself, of the first emperor of Rome paying just a ridiculous amount of money for a raven that had been taught to say, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's like Hail Augustus, commanding conqueror. It just paid so much money for this bird. So if you didn't already know, lots of corvids can mimic, which makes them really cool. The Romans loved birds that can talk, so parrots and corvids, they were just a little bit obsessed. One of the other reasons they were kind of obsessed with ravens in particular is with this practice of ornithomancy, which is divining the future by listening to the sounds and watching the flights of birds. So particularly ravens were associated with this. If anyone, I'm assuming a good number of people in the room, know of Odin with his 2 ravens from Norse mythology. So Apollo kind of had a similar thing going on. He had one raven who, the story said, would fly to Earth and then report back what was going on to Apollo. So they associated corvids really strongly with knowing what was going on, and also like associated with prophecy, and this is where you start to see that kind of good and bad omen sort of thing coming out. So a lot of this iconography is starting to show some connections with Apollo as well. This is also really interesting. This is from the House of the Golden Bracelet in Pompeii, and it shows a magpie just surrounded by other species of birds that we know the Romans had domesticated, so it's kind of putting them nice and central, and there's something going on there. Let's jump forward about 1,000 years. I know, no small jump. Everything has changed. They're no longer pets, they're no longer being associated with the gods. In fact, everything's kind of bad. People don't like them very much. So essentially, people were starting to think they're a bit gross, and they didn't like them very much. People probably have their idea ahead of like filthy streets in the medieval period, and the corvids would come along and eat that, and people were like, well, it's good that they're getting rid of the rubbish, but they're gross. We don't really like them very much. So medieval bestiaries, which we start to see coming about, are essentially they're Christian morality tales of animal behavior, so they're not a direct like natural history or anything. But they start to be talking about, they're associated with the devil and evil and gossiping and sin. It's not entirely bad, but a lot of negative associations really start coming about. Later on, we do start to see the plague beaks as well, which has been suggested that it might have been modeled on corvid beaks from when they were like eating the dead bodies in the streets during plagues. So it's very bad in general. Then it gets worse. So in the 16th century, the Tudor vermin laws came about. There was a lot of factors that brought this about, which was essentially there had been plagues, there had been the Little Ice Age, so there was climate change. The government was, well, the church still owned lots of pockets of land. There was a human population increase, so there was a food shortage. And rather than actually deal with the food shortage, they blamed all animals that eat things. That seems reasonable, right? They literally put bounties on the heads of lots of animals. That very first law in 1932 specifically targeted crows. And I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it says destroy crows somewhere in it. So things took a very sharp turn for the negative. Now I just want to run through some of the crimes that corvids were being accused of. I can see some people recognizing it, that's a good sign. So one of the biggest ones, they're accused of murdering sheep and lambs. Happy? Essentially a more recent study that was on hooded crows found that only 0.12% of lambs were killed in association with hooded crows per year. 98% of those lambs were weak to the point they would have died anyway, so you can't really say the corvids are at fault. Another study has also said ravenbills cannot pierce the skull of a squirrel, let alone the skull of a sheep or of a calf or a lamb. So it's very unlikely that this is as big a problem as people are making it out to be. Theft of songbird eggs, this is another huge accusation against them. But studies have found this is nowhere near as common as people make it out to be. We've seen a sharp decline of songbird populations, that's true, but it's more associated with humans destroying the hedgerows that they nest in. Songbirds generally use hedgerows as a defense mechanism against predators, so if you take the hedgerow away, they're extremely vulnerable. So that's a huge problem. Yeah, crows will occasionally steal a songbird egg or a chick, that is true, but it's nowhere near as big of a problem as people are making it out to be. Shiny objects. Now I'm gonna kind of ruin some people's day, and I apologize. It's not true, it's not true, it's never been true. So actually corvids are terrified of everything, especially new things in their environment. So it's kind of weird that this has become a folklore thing. There is some interesting study showing that there are behavioral differences between urban and rural birds. In urban centers, they will become more courageous, but it's usually to find things to eat, not to steal shiny trinkets. The last one I'm going to talk about here is omens of the fall of the empire. I'm specifically referring to the ravens at the Tower of London, which is a weird thing in and of itself, because if we've got like wild raven populations being decimated, why are we really happy that they're in this specific place in London? It just feels a bit weird. But that's a Victorian Gothic invention primarily for tourism, which makes sense and it's fine, but it's like, it doesn't go as far back as people think it is. Also, the point is, back in the Roman and Greek periods, not only were corvids were also good omens. They weren't just bad omens, so it's something we've lost over time, and we just found them wholly negative. So essentially, we're seeing a lot of exaggerated accusations. Many are based on folklore, and a lot of scapegoating going on. So just to kind of jump into the modern day very briefly, a lot of these accusations are persisting, and there's a lot of debate going on, which can get really quite toxic. Chris Packham has been in the center of it for a little while. People still really, really like killing corvids, which is kind of troubling when the facts don't really say that people need to. So in short, the story so far, we've seen from associations with deities to persecution and disdain, exaggerated accusations and scapegoating, negative media coverages, and prejudices that do not fit the facts. It's a bit familiar, isn't it? So for anyone who's not getting what I'm referring to here, and I think a good number of you are, if you don't know your history of the trans community, it's basically this. I specifically haven't put corvids on anywhere of this slide, because this is just a history of the trans community. If you don't know, Intercom Trust runs a free seminar a couple of times a year with the title somewhat similar to Gender Variance in History and Culture. It's very good. I strongly recommend it. So, as I said, I don't like leaving things on a sad note, so I have a proposal, 3 stages, nice and simple, of how to fix everything, for both corvids and for the trans community, which is essentially challenging the negative biases and prejudices, educating with facts and lived experiences, and celebrating all of our history, all of our positive aspects, and our diversity. Now, just before I completely wrap up, because I know you can feel it's coming, I have a lot of people to acknowledge. So firstly, my funding bodies, the universities I work with, the whole animal feeding team, some of them are online, hello. The Humane Bioarchaeology Lab, Historic England, Cornish Jackdaw Project, who I did placements with, Portable Antiquity Scheme, which is all the nice iconography I showed earlier. Loads of museums that I have had my bones and stuff from, where I've been analysing, and some of the isotope data, they've all kindly given permission for that, so I will acknowledge them here. And of course, all the LGBT plus groups that I'm a part of that fundamentally are why I'm here, including, of course, all of you here at PRISM. So thank you ever so much for listening.